Ypres, Belgium, April 1915. Lieutenant Morris watched in horror as his men sank into the mud, not falling, but being pulled down by dozens of pale, rotting hands. Their screams echoed across no man's land until the earth swallowed them whole. The next morning, 13 sets of boot prints led to that same spot and simply stopped. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale that proves some soldiers never die. They just join a different army. The Second Battle of Ypres raged across the Belgian countryside, turning the once picturesque medieval town into an apocalyptic wasteland. On April 22, 1915, as German forces unleashed clouds of chlorine gas that rolled across no man's land like a poisonous tide, Corporal Edward Hargreaves of the British Expeditionary Forces Reconnaissance Unit received his latest assignment: investigate reports of missing patrols near Hill 60. Hargreaves was known among his fellow soldiers for his methodical nature and unwavering rationality. A former police detective from London, he approached each reconnaissance mission with detective's precision, dismissing the growing whispers of supernatural occurrences as products of battle fatigue and shell shock. Ghost stories, he would say with a slight smile, are for children and the weak-minded. But even Hargreaves couldn't deny the strange atmosphere that had settled over the trenches in recent weeks. The night watches reported seeing shadowy figures walking through no man's land, only to vanish when flares illuminated the cratered landscape. An unusually high number of patrols had gone missing, their disappearances marked by inexplicable cold spots and unexplained footprints in the mud. His new partner, Private James "Jimmy" Carlyle, was everything Hargreaves wasn't: young, devoutly religious, and increasingly troubled by the rumors circulating through the dugouts. "They say the dead are walking, Corporal," Carlyle had whispered during their first briefing together. "That they're calling to the living, leading them away into the mist." As they prepared for their night patrol, Hargreaves studied the intelligence reports spread across the makeshift table in their dugout. The latest disappearance involved an entire section. 12 men who had ventured out to repair communication lines and never returned. The only clue was a cryptic message found scrawled in a logbook. They're all still out there, still waiting, still watching. The setting sun cast long shadows across the trench walls as Hargreaves checked his equipment one final time. Compass, map case, revolver, and the new gas mask that had become essential gear since the Germans' devastating chemical attack. Above them, the evening sky turned a sickly yellow-green, a lingering effect of the day's gas attacks. "Remember," Hargreaves told Carlyle as they prepared to move out, "stick to protocol. We're looking for signs of enemy movement and any trace of our missing men, nothing more." But even as he spoke the words, a chill ran down his spine, one that had nothing to do with the April evening air. The trenches fell silent as Hargreaves and Carlyle emerged into no man's land, their boots sinking into the churned earth. The darkness wrapped around them like a shroud, broken only by occasional artillery flashes that illuminated the grotesque landscape in stark relief. Twisted barbed wire, shattered equipment, and things that had once been men. A thin mist began creeping across the ground, bringing with it an unnatural chill that seemed to seep through their wool uniforms. Hargreaves consulted his compass, frowning as the needle swung erratically. "Magnetic disruption from all the shell fragments," he muttered, more to reassure himself than inform Carlyle. They advanced cautiously, using shell holes for cover. The dig site near Hill 60 lay ahead, where sappers had reported strange sounds emanating from their tunnels, voices speaking in empty chambers, tools scraping against earth when no one was working. 3 days ago, an entire mining detail had refused to return underground. "Corporal," Carlyle whispered suddenly, his voice tight with tension. "Look at these." He pointed to a set of footprints in the mud, British Army boots, but something was wrong about them. The tracks appeared to start in the middle of open ground, as if their owner had materialized from thin air, and they led directly toward German lines before stopping abruptly. Hargreaves knelt to examine them, his detective's mind racing. The impressions were deep, too deep for any living man's weight, and the mud around them was frosted despite the relatively mild April night. As he studied the tracks, a document from the intelligence reports flashed through his memory, a statement from Lieutenant Thomas Langley's last letter home before his disappearance. "The nights are the worst. We hear them walking above our dugout, boots crunching on frozen ground, even when the temperature's well above freezing. The men whisper that it's the lost ones, still trying to find their way back to our lines. I tell them it's nonsense, of course, but sometimes, in the darkness, I see them. God help me, I see them." A star shell burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in harsh white light. In that moment, both men saw it, a solitary figure standing atop a ridge about 50 yards away, wearing the mud-caked uniform of a British officer. The figure turned slowly toward them, revealing a face that was somehow both there and not there, like smoke caught in the shape of a man. "Lieutenant Langley," Carlyle breathed, crossing himself. The figure raised an arm, pointing deeper into no man's land. Then the star shell's light faded, plunging them back into darkness. When the next flare illuminated the ridge seconds later, the figure was gone. But the footprints leading away from where it had stood were fresh. Following the ghostly officer's trail led them to a section of battlefield neither man recognized, though both had patrolled this area for weeks. The shell holes here were older, partially filled with stagnant water that reflected nothing, not even the periodic flash of artillery. An abandoned field kitchen lay half buried in mud, its wheels frozen in place as if the earth itself had reached up to claim it. "This doesn't make sense," Hargreaves muttered, consulting his map again. "According to this, we should be in the middle of—" He stopped abruptly, realizing what felt wrong. The constant background noise of war, distant gunfire, shell fire, the creak of equipment and murmur of men in the trenches had completely ceased. The silence pressed against their eardrums like a physical weight. A rhythmic tapping sound cut through the stillness. Tap, 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 tap. "Underground," Carlyle whispered, his face pale in the darkness. "It's coming from below." Hargreaves recognized the pattern. Not random noise, but a military signal code used by sappers trapped in collapsed tunnels. He pulled out his notebook, transcribing the message. HEREWARLLHER. The tapping grew louder, seemingly coming from multiple directions now. As they listened, frozen in place, the ground began to vibrate beneath their feet. The mud around them started to shift and bubble, as if something was trying to rise up from below. A gust of wind brought the sharp, distinctive odor of chlorine gas, but mixed with something else, the sickly sweet smell of decay. Hargreaves fumbled for his gas mask, but Carlyle grabbed his arm, pointing at the ground with a shaking hand. Emerging from the mud were objects: a tin cup, a torn paybook, a gold wedding ring, all bearing the marks of the 1st Battalion. Artifacts from the missing patrol, preserved in the earth like archaeological treasures. But they weren't simply lying there. They were being pushed up from below by pale, mud-streaked hands reaching through the soil. Lieutenant Langley's apparition appeared again, closer this time. In the weird half-light, they could see details they'd missed before. The gaping wound in his chest, the way his uniform rippled as if underwater, the hollow darkness where his eyes should be. He spoke, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The tunnels, they didn't collapse. We found something down there, something that had been waiting since long before this war. And now, we can't leave. None of us can leave. More figures began to materialize around them, soldiers in various states of decay, some still wearing gas masks, others bearing the marks of artillery fire. Each one bore the insignia of the missing 1st Battalion. They moved with unnatural grace, leaving frost in their footprints, all advancing slowly toward Hargreaves and Carlyle. "They're not ghosts," Carlyle breathed, his soldiers' training warring with rising panic. "Dear God, they're not just ghosts." Military training took over as Hargreaves and Carlyle retreated strategically, using shell holes for cover. The ghost soldiers didn't pursue. They simply stood watching, their hollow eyes tracking every movement. Only Lieutenant Langley's spirit moved, continuing to gesture toward something in the darkness behind him. "It's a gas-induced hallucination," Hargreaves insisted, his detective's mind scrambling for rational explanations. "The Germans must have deployed a new chemical agent, something that causes mass delusions. That would explain the missing patrols, the strange behavior." "Does it explain this?" Carlyle interrupted, holding up the paybook they'd recovered. The water-damaged pages contained service records for Private Michael Collins, one of the missing men. But as they watched, the ink began to run and reshape itself, forming new words. Below, all below. The guns couldn't kill what was already dead. A distant rumble grew beneath their feet. Not artillery this time, but something deeper. The ghost soldiers began to sink into the earth, disappearing feet first, as if being pulled down by invisible hands. Only Langley remained, his form becoming more solid, more present. "I led them down here," he said, his voice clearer now, thick with regret. "We were supposed to plant explosives, collapse the German tunnel network. But we found their dig site instead, found what they uncovered, what they were trying to seal away again." The ground cracked open nearby, revealing the entrance to a tunnel. Unlike the other sap trenches and dugouts they'd seen, this shaft was ancient, its walls lined with stone that predated the war by centuries. The air flowing from its depths carried the musty scent of opened tombs and disturbed earth. Military records recovered after the war revealed a strange directive issued to German forces in the sector, dated just days before the first gas attack. Upon discovery of pre-Roman artifacts and structures during mining operations, all excavation is to cease immediately. These sites are to be collapsed, and their locations expunged from all maps. Any personnel exposed to the contents are to be considered contaminated and must not be allowed to return to friendly lines. Looking into the tunnel's depths, Hargreaves felt his rationality crumbling. His gas mask hung useless at his side. This was no chemical weapon, no trick of warfare. The hole in the earth seemed to breathe, calling to them with the voices of the lost. "We have to go down," Carlyle whispered, his faith giving way to fatalistic acceptance. "It's the only way to end this, to help them." Langley's ghost nodded slowly, then spoke one final time. "The Germans tried to seal it with gas and shells. But some things can't be killed by modern weapons. Some wars never end. They just wait." The rumbling grew stronger as Hargreaves made his decision. They were soldiers of the British Army. They would not abandon their men, even if it meant following them into hell itself. The tunnel descent felt endless. Their electric torches cast weak circles of light that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The walls changed as they went deeper. Rough-cut earth gave way to ancient stonework, then to something older still. Symbols carved by forgotten hands lined the passage, worn smooth by centuries of seeping groundwater. The air grew thick with more than just the usual tunnel atmosphere. Each breath felt heavy with memory, as if they were inhaling the last gasps of every soldier who had died in the war above. Their footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes coming back to them as the marching of phantom battalions. "Listen," Carlyle whispered, pressing his ear to the wall. Through the stone came the muffled sounds of battle, men shouting in English, German, and languages far older. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of distant artillery that had fallen silent decades or centuries ago. They found evidence of the German excavation, abandoned mining tools, scattered equipment, and hastily erected timber supports. A broken crate bore the label of a German archaeological unit, known for recovering artifacts from war zones. Scattered pages from their field journal revealed increasingly frantic entries. The artifacts suggest a temple or burial chamber, but the architecture matches no known period. Men report hearing voices in sealed chambers. 3 miners disappeared today while attempting to access the lower level. The voices are getting louder. The final entry was a single sentence written in shaking hand. "God forgive us. We've given them a way back." Their torch beams caught movement ahead. The ghostly soldiers of the 1st Battalion, still in formation despite their spectral state, marching deeper into the earth. Leading them was Lieutenant Langley, but his appearance had changed. The wound in his chest now seemed to pulse with a cold light, and his uniform had taken on the ancient styling of warriors long dead. "They're not just haunting this place," Hargreaves realized, his voice hoarse. "They're being recruited." The walls widened into a vast chamber. Their lights revealed rows upon rows of soldiers, not just from their war, but from every war that had ever been fought over this blood-soaked ground. Roman legionnaires stood shoulder to shoulder with medieval knights, Napoleonic infantry beside Great War Tommies. All bore the same hollow-eyed gaze, the same pulsing wounds. At the chamber's center stood an altar of black stone, covered in carvings that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The missing patrol from the 1st Battalion knelt before it, their forms flickering between flesh and spirit as ancient words spilled from their lips. Their wounds blazed with the same cold light that had infected Langley. "Dear God," Carlyle breathed, his faith crumbling in the face of this revelation. "They're building an army." But it was Hargreaves who asked the crucial question, his detective's mind cutting to the heart of the horror. Yes, but for what war? The chamber's ancient air grew thick with the sound of ghostly whispers as more spirits emerged from the walls. Centuries of fallen soldiers drawn to the dark altar. Hargreaves recognized the tactical problem. They were surrounded, outflanked by an enemy that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons. His service revolver felt useless against his hip. Lieutenant Langley's ghost approached, leading the transformed men of the 1st Battalion. Their wounds now pulsed in unison, casting rhythmic shadows that danced across the chamber walls. When Langley spoke, his voice carried echoes of every battlefield command ever given. "Join us, brothers. The wars above are temporary, meaningless. Here we fight the eternal war, the only war that matters. Your wounds will never heal, but they will give you power. Your deaths will have purpose. Carlyle stepped forward, drawn by the voices of his lost comrades. The cold light from their wounds reflected in his eyes, and for a moment, Hargreaves saw an echo of future pain there. The wounds Carlyle would receive 2 months later at Passchendaele, the ones that would end his life in a field hospital. "Jimmy, stop," Hargreaves commanded, falling back on years of military authority. "Remember your training. Remember who you are." A German officer's journal, recovered near the altar, provided a chilling insight. The entity below feeds on warriors' deaths, growing stronger with each battle above. The ancient peoples built this chamber not to worship it, but to trap it. Every war fought here has only made it stronger. The gas attack wasn't meant to kill the British. It was meant to seal this place forever. Carlyle turned back, tears cutting tracks through the tunnel grime on his face. "But can't you see, Corporal? This is why we're here. All the death, all the senseless killing. It was never about nations or kings. We were just feeding it. All of us. Every soldier who ever died, in anger." The ghostly army began to advance, their phantom weapons raised. Each fallen warrior bore wounds that glowed with the same cold light. Bayonet strikes, bullet holes, sword cuts, arrow wounds, each marking the moment of death in battle. Hargreaves made his decision. Reaching into his kit, he withdrew the signal flares meant to mark enemy positions. The magnesium compounds inside burned hot enough to melt metal. He looked at the ancient timber supports, at the crumbling stone walls held up by centuries of compressed earth. "You're right about one thing," he told Langley's ghost. "Some wars need to end." The chamber erupted in searing white light as the flares ignited. The ghosts recoiled, their cold light overwhelmed by the magnesium's burning glare. Above them, the ceiling began to crack. The chamber's collapse began slowly, then accelerated with the inexorable force of geology. Centuries of compressed earth groaned as ancient timbers snapped. The ghostly army surged forward, but their supernatural power meant nothing against tons of falling rock and soil. "Run!" Hargreaves grabbed Carlyle's arm, dragging him toward the tunnel entrance. Behind them, Lieutenant Langley's ghost raised his spectral sword one final time, his hollow eyes now filled with something almost like gratitude. The cold light from the altar flickered and died as the chamber crumbled. The voices of 1,000 years of warfare rose in one last battle cry, then fell silent. Hargreaves and Carlyle scrambled through the collapsing tunnel, dodging falling debris as the earth reclaimed its dark secrets. They emerged into the pre-dawn darkness of no man's land, just as the last tunnel section collapsed. The ground settled with a final shudder, leaving nothing but a massive crater where the entrance had been. Above them, the first rays of sunrise began to pierce the ever-present smoke and gas clouds. Official reports from that day record an unusually quiet morning on the Ypres front. For the first time in weeks, no patrols went missing. No ghostly figures were seen wandering through the wire. The war continued, as wars do, but something had changed in that sector. Hargreaves submitted his patrol report with careful omissions, writing only that they had discovered and collapsed a previously unknown German tunnel complex. His unofficial account, found years later in a sealed letter addressed to his wife, told a different story. The horror of it wasn't in the supernatural, my dear. It was in the recognition. Every soldier down there, from every age, still burned with the anger and hatred that had killed them, still fighting their wars, still carrying their wounds, still believing in the cause that had sent them to their deaths. I fear that's the true horror of war. Not that it kills us, but that it never lets us rest. Even now, I wonder, did we truly seal it away, or simply bury it deeper? Do the dead still march beneath our feet, recruiting from each new generation of fallen? Perhaps every war is the same war, feeding the same ancient hunger. Carlyle survived another month before being killed by artillery fire near Passchendaele, exactly as Hargreaves had foreseen in the chamber. His body was never recovered. Some soldiers swore they saw him afterward, walking the night patrols with other ghostly sentries, his wounds glowing with that same cold light. Hargreaves lived through the war, but never served in combat again. He spent his remaining years researching other battlefields, other wars. His notes, found after his death in 1956, contain detailed maps of ancient burial grounds and temple ruins beneath every major battleground in Europe. His final journal entry reads simply, "The guns fall silent, the wars end, the armies withdraw, but in the deep places, in the dark earth beneath every battlefield, they're still marching, still waiting, still recruiting, and the next war is always coming." If this document from the War Maestro's archive left you questioning what lies beneath the battlefields, you'd do well to join our battalion of truth seekers. March over to that subscribe button. After all, safety in numbers is more than just a military doctrine. Ring that notification bell. When you hear it toll, you'll know another classified file has surfaced from the depths. Share this account with fellow soldiers of the supernatural, those who understand that some war stories can never be found in official records, and leave a comment below. Have you ever stood on an old battlefield and felt watched? Perhaps you've heard phantom marching in places where no troops have passed for centuries. Remember, not all who fall in battle rest in peace. Some are still recruiting.